thanks everyone for coming, and it was a pretty great response to this webinar. We know it's a hot topic and an endlessly complicated and tiresome topic. So we thought it would be a good idea to do this event and to help, where we can with the information, the limited time that we have today, and going over this stuff. And then certainly will be available after for questions, during this webinar, but you'll have my information as a result of this, as well as Jen's if you have any other questions from there. So Jen, I don't know, we'll just do introductions really quick with Jen. So, my name's Emily. I am the owner of Ally HR Partners. We are an HR consulting firm. We work with small businesses that either don't have their own HR person at all, or maybe they have someone who's kind of wearing HR as one of multiple hats for their business. And, that can be really difficult, even if you have only 5 employees, but certainly if you have more than that, depending on your employee population, to really keep up with, compliance requirements and even just things to kind of get ahead of employee issues or avoid them. So we help come in and inject expertise into your business to be able to do that. And I'm partnering with Jen today from Complete Payroll. I don't know, Jen, if you want to do any sort of quick introduction. If not, that's cool. I'll keep rolling.
Sure. No, I'll just do a quick one. I know a lot of you. I work for Complete Payroll, and like Emily said, we have partnered up together because we're the experts in payroll, and we can facilitate a lot of the requirements that Emily talks about, such as time off accruals and sick leave and things like that. So we facilitate that, but Emily is the expert in really diving deep down into your business specifically, and figuring out what your needs are, and then we work together to make sure that it goes along with payroll and timekeeping, and we can kind of facilitate that together. So if I haven't met you yet, it's nice to meet you, and I'll definitely reach out to you if you have any questions. Emily and I would be more than happy to answer them.
Awesome. All right, and just quick housekeeping. So there'll be questions at the end. So if you want a Q&A session at the end, and depending on how many there are, we'll try to get to them all, but definitely jot down questions throughout the presentation. And I would just recommend taking notes anyway, because a lot of the information we're going to cover is high level. And so it may just spark some things in your brain that you think are exposure areas for your business, or just things that you maybe want to take back to your team, or call me or Jen about later to ask questions about, or try to implement solutions for. So recommend taking notes. And then if you have technical issues or questions or anything, you can unmute yourself and ask them, certainly, but also the chat is available. You can send questions for the end of the presentation or about any technical issues to the chat as well. Otherwise, we will get started because there is a lot to cover. So let's go. So just a really quick disclaimer here. This is not an exhaustive presentation on employer required leave, administrative requirements, or eligibility, or anything like that. That would be like a 10-hour long presentation that no one would want to sit through. So this is general information to educate you in a general way on what some of your obligations or requirements might be, to give you ideas of areas where you may need to kind of do a little bit of work to, one, reduce your exposure to compliance issues, but also maybe really take back control of some leave abuse and things that are occurring in your business. All right, so really high level here. I would assume almost everyone joining this presentation is a New York State employer, and certainly requirements vary if you have employees in other states. So that's like a first little disclaimer note you want to make. If you have employees in other states, you definitely want to consider what the leave requirements might be in addition to the ones we're going to talk about today for those states. But just a quick kind of leave 101 here for New York State employers. These are the leaves that are out there. So paid family leave, that's been around for years now. That is all employers, basically, with a few caveats, are required to provide paid family leave to their employees in New York State. It's to care for a family member or for bonding after childbirth. So caring for a family member can involve someone who is sick with COVID, but also anyone who is sick for other reasons. It's 12 weeks as of 2021. That went up from 10 weeks last year. 67% of pay for the employee at a max rate that you see there. And that's paid by the state through the disability insurance carrier. So similar to disability in that way. FMLA is one that's obviously been around forever. That doesn't apply to you unless you have more than 50 employees. That's also 12 weeks of pay, which now, New York paid family leave and FMLA run together, and we'll talk about that, but that's very relevant. It provides job protection. It is not paid, unlike the PFL, and it is federally mandated. So not through New York State, but at the federal level. And that's for the same reasons as PFL, but also an employee's own health conditions can qualify them for FMLA, unlike PFL. New York State paid sick leave. We've talked about that in almost every webinar that we've done in the last 6 months. That's the additional paid time off that employers need to provide to employees for qualifying sick reasons. So that's a little bit different than the other leaves because it is just paid time off by the employer. There's no paperwork required and things, but that is an element that's out there now. And then, of course, disability leave through New York State. And workers' compensation. And then, of course, there's other leaves out there, voting leave, bone marrow donation, blood donation. We're not going to cover that stuff today. But if you don't have things in your handbook about those leaves, those should at least be stated in there, and you should at least be aware that they exist. So if someone's asking for time off for that reasons, you know that you might have a legal obligation to do that. And then, of course, I think the reason most people are here is the supplemental, hopefully temporary additional leaves that are out there now, which is the New York State COVID leave and all the other COVID related exceptions, which we're going to cover first. So the first note here, and there's going to be slides like this throughout the presentation, but if anything I just talked about is completely new information to you, or that you you have employees who have any of those qualifying situations and you're not providing protected or paid leave to them, and you don't have a plan for any of those leaves and how to administer them and familiarity with paperwork or carriers, make a note right now. That's obviously a big issue. So if you just make sure that you understand that those probably are obligations for you if you aren't covering them now. All right, so again, I think this is probably why everyone is here, is to talk about the COVID leaves that are out there. And this seems to be an ever-changing topic with New York State, and I'm sure it will continue to be as the efficacy of vaccines becomes more clear and the variants and how they're going to take hold becomes more clear. So let's talk about kind of where we're at now. So New York State COVID leave, it started way last year at the beginning of the pandemic. It's leave that's in addition to any other types of leave that are out there for employees. Here are the requirements here. So it really depends on your employer size, like a lot of this stuff, but it basically ranges from 5 paid days with an additional 11 days of protected time, or a full 14 calendar days worth of paid time that's protected. And this is all paid by the employer with no, it's not paid through a carrier. There's no inherent, tax reimbursement benefits or anything like that. This is just paid by you in addition to any other type of time off for the employees. So some other notes about New York State COVID sick leave. So now at this point, what I just showed you in terms of what your employees are eligible for, whether it's the 5 paid days, the 14 paid days, employees are now entitled to take this up to 3 times. So that means potentially 14 days of paid leave for COVID up to 3 times. So 14 times 3, you can do the math and know what number of days that is. So this is something that's new. We did, put out some material on this, but if you're still not familiar with it, basically how they could end up taking 3 is that if the first leave they took in the beginning or anytime up till now with COVID was due to exposure. So that's happened a lot, right? Where someone had a family member or a roommate or something that had COVID or had symptoms. And so they themselves were subject to isolate or quarantine and took this time, even if they didn't have COVID or ever test positive. If they take their first leave for that, but then later in the line or down the line, they've tested positive and potentially could test positive a second time, because we've seen that, they could be eligible to take 3 of those leaves. So again, if the first leave was taken for a non-positive test reason and the employee then tests positive for COVID and needs to take more leave, then you do need to make an up to 2 additional leaves available to them. The likelihood of that happening is obviously pretty low, but the likelihood of them being able to take 2 of these, I think, is pretty high. A lot of clients have had people, that need to isolate or quarantine just for precautionary reasons. And, it's certainly not unlikely that they would get COVID at least once at some point, if they haven't already in the next year, that they would need this again. So it's very likely you will have to end up giving them this leave twice. Important note also, if employees voluntarily travel, we're starting to see people do that again. They are not eligible for the New York State COVID sick leave. So just keep that in mind. They're kind of SOL if they decide to go on vacation and when they come back, they can't work because they, are required to quarantine or isolate. So just make sure that you understand that as well. Some other notes that are super important as you're navigating these situations as they come up: employers cannot make employees apply paid sick time or other kinds of earned paid time off when they're eligible for New York State COVID leave. So that New York State paid sick leave, any PTO time you have, any other type of accrued time off your employees have, you cannot require them to use that in lieu of paying them this additional time off for New York State COVID leave. So make sure that you understand that major difference between the paid sick leave. Employers may allow employees to use other paid time off for any portion of the COVID leave that is unpaid. So if someone, if you're an employer that's only required to provide 5 paid days as part of the COVID New York State sick leave, and the employer obviously might need to quarantine for longer than those 5 days, they can choose to apply any other type of accrued time off to that time so they don't take it unpaid. So that is an option. If you mandate an employee to receive a negative test to return to work, you do need to pay them for that time, even if that time goes above and beyond the 5 paid sick days that you're required, or the 14, depending on your size. So an example of this would be, I'm an employee, I tested positive for COVID, and you're trying to be extremely cautious as an employer. Before you let me come back to work, you want me to go get tested a second time to prove that I'm no longer positive for COVID before I come back. And for some reason, when I do that, the test results don't come back in a timely way, and my leave then has to extend beyond the 14 days, 3 more days, and before I get my results and you let me return. So that this law says that you would need to pay me for those 3 additional days on top of the 14. So if you're considering a rule like that, where you make someone test negative to come back, you may want to reconsider that given this rule. And it's just additional steps for you to navigate and administratively try to manage. And then employers may require proof of positive test results to take the additional leave. So yay, at least this is something that's on the employer's side. But if someone has tested positive and they say they need to be out additional time, even though they've already taken the COVID leave for maybe precautionary reasons, you can require proof that they actually tested positive in order to pay them for this time. So that's really great, and at least gives you some legs to stand on. Sorry, my cat was locked away and now she somehow escaped and is joining the webinar as usual. All right. Some additional notes. I know this list is very long for the New York State sick leave, but this is just kind of where we're at. Employers, oh, sorry, we're still on the same slide. Okay. Some additional notes though about COVID leave that do still apply to New York State leave is on the FFCRA or the CARES Act leave. So employers, as of December 31st, this is no longer required. So, I'm sure we all know that prior to December 31st, if someone was missing time due to needing to quarantine or isolate, whether they were positive or precautionary, this FFCRA leave in the form of the emergency paid sick leave and the emergency paid family leave kind of superseded the New York State required leave for COVID. Now this is voluntary. And you may ask yourself, why would I voluntarily decide to subject myself to even more leave for COVID? However, if you need to provide that 5 paid days or the 14 paid days of the New York State sick leave anyway, it really benefits you to still have a policy that mirrors FFCRA required leave where you make employees eligible for this, because if you use this, you can take a tax credit for this, and your friends at Complete Payroll or whatever you're getting your payroll done will code the time missed properly, so that happens. But that is a reason why you would want to keep FFCRA leave around, quote unquote. Again, it's a voluntary policy that you technically are implementing that mirrors the rules of this, but you definitely consider that because you are going to need to still provide the time per New York State, and at least this is some way to recoup some of the money that you're paying out for that. So we recommend developing a temporary policy which outlines basically your company's new leave policy that mirrors FFCRA leave so that you can get some of that money back. All right. And I think this is basically what we just talked about. So again, you can apply an employee's eligibility for FFCRA leave concurrent with the New York State required leave and get the tax credit. A quick note to definitely remember here, this leave and credit can only be applied once, unlike the New York State COVID leave, which they can take 3 times. So the FFCRA leave gives them up to 80 hours, which is basically 2 weeks of paid time for needing to isolate or quarantine. Once they use that, they're done, even if they used it last year. Calendar years don't matter. So just make sure that you're not over applying this leave in the case that you ever get audited, this tax credit, because you could see penalties for that. So if someone has to take the New York State leave 3 times, you're only allowed to kind of run it concurrent with this FFCRA leave once. And we already talked about that last point there. All right. So one more element to cover that plays into this COVID leave is the New York State kind of combined disability and PFL benefit that's out there. So this is a little bit unknown because to me, it's like a very rare circumstance of when someone would need to use this. But basically, if someone's exhausted all of the leave that's available through the required New York State paid time, and they still are subject to quarantine or isolate for some reason, basically they are eligible to apply for this benefit through New York State. And also it counts if you're, caring for someone that has COVID as well and need to miss the time. So basically what New York State's done is they combined your benefit eligibility for disability and your benefit eligibility for paid family leave. And now that basically gets you full pay through the insurance carrier for this leave time versus the $170 a week that would, you would get from disability, or the 67% of your pay for PFL. So everyone that I've heard that have just tried to use this, it's really like a narrow approval channel. You need to have like actual real documentation from the Department of Health, which substantiates the need for this. They're pretty meticulous about, reviewing this for eligibility, but it is out there and you should be aware of it. If you have any questions about it, your carrier certainly could answer them, but this is out there as well. All right, so that's a lot of information. Sorry if your head is exploding, but welcome to my life. But so let's try to summarize and just, get some takeaway points here to make it a little bit easier. One, definitely remember that working from home disqualifies a person from any of this leave. So if you have, I understand that not everyone's work allows them to work from home, but if someone needs to miss time, especially if it's just a few days while they're getting tested or something, and there is some type of possibility for them to work from home, you might just want to let them do that you're going to be paying them anyway if they have to stay home. So at least, they're having to work and you're getting some productivity out of them for that time. So you might want to consider that, but remember that disqualifies someone from being eligible for any of this time. A general order of operations. So before you would make anybody use any type of accrued time off they have, you first want to make sure they've exhausted all of their New York State COVID leave benefit, overlap that with the FFCRA leave if possible and available still. Then consider if they're eligible for the New York State disability and combined PFL benefit. And then potentially offer additional employer provided time off. So that would be an example of where you are mandating that they can't return to work. It's not the Department of Health, right? Like if you're requiring them to get a negative test. And then if all of that's been exhausted and the answer to all of that is that there's nothing that you need to do, then you can require the employee to apply any earned PTO or new New York State sick time or any other type of accrued time off. Don't mix paid sick leave and COVID paid leave. So again, the new New York State paid sick leave law this year has nothing to do with COVID, and you can't make people use that for COVID. So make sure that you're not doing that. I'm sure New York State's going to have a ton of fun auditing people for those things. Please keep that in mind. I guarantee you'll get dinged for that later. If you require people to miss work, you should be paying them. So again, if it's because of a negative test or some other reason, in general, if as an employer, whether it's COVID or not, if you're telling someone they can't come to work in this world, you probably should be paying them, or at least having it be a protected absence and not counting it against them from an attendance standpoint. And then be aware of documentation requirements and rules. Not going to go into that, but all of these leaves have their own paperwork, their own processes, their own rules about what you can require and not, and how much time you have to give people to complete paperwork. So if you don't know about that, there's a lot of information on New York State's website for those things, and you can read them. And of course, we're available to answer any questions as well. All right, so that's COVID. So let's spend a little bit of time just to give you some education and awareness on the other leaves that you're required to provide in New York State as an employer, and some tips basically that you can walk away with to make sure that you're doing this the best way possible to protect your business from a legal standpoint, but also a financial burden standpoint. So the first is New York State paid sick leave. Again, we have covered this so many times in all of the webinars, basically, because it interacts with everything. I'm not going to spend time on it right now, but if you go to our website, alihrpartners.com/resources, there is a really, really extensive webinar about this subject. So I would recommend spending the time and watching it. It's about an hour, I would say. It's a lot of information, but it's super extensive and gets very detailed about things to consider for your business. So even if you think that you don't have like an extremely sound plan that's been like professionally vetted for complying with this law, I would recommend watching this because it might, show you some things that you might need to modify or tweak or question. So that's New York State paid sick leave. New York State paid family leave. We covered this a little bit, but again, just the big takeaway here is most people probably know about this, but this leave did increase from 10 weeks of leave eligibility within a year to 12 weeks as of January 1st. And it did go up from 60% of pay to 67% of an employee's pay. And again, that's through your disability carrier. Again, that's for family member, let's also say family member care, child bonding, and military leave. And it overlaps with FMLA for those subjects. And then another important thing to note here, if you don't know, this can be taken in single day increments for up to a year after the birth of a child. So unlike FMLA, it can't be taken in like 30 minutes, 1 hour, but it can be single day. It does not have to be like a full week or a full month or the full 12 weeks. So if you have someone that had a child and for the next year, they want to take every Friday off for paid family leave, unfortunately, they have the option to do that. So if you're having conversations with employees like that, understand that they have the right and the access to that, unless there's some really extenuating circumstance that would impact your business, but rarely would that stand up. So make sure that you understand that you really need to entertain those conversations. And then FMLA, old tried and true FMLA, which is basically becoming irrelevant to us in New York State. But if you have over 50 employees on top of all this stuff, employees are required or are eligible to be provided up to 12 weeks of unpaid but job protected leave for qualifying situations. That includes all the same reasons they're eligible for PFL, plus any of their own self medical conditions or needs. So PFL is just for caring for others or bonding. FMLA is those things, plus if I myself are sick or have to have surgery or something like that, or have a medical condition that's chronic that causes me to miss work or whatever. FMLA is the biggest area where there is abuse of leave because, as I mentioned, you can take this intermittently in as little of an increment that you allow any paid time off usage. So if I tell my employees they can use PTO time or sick time in 15-minute intervals, guess what? I can then use FMLA in 15-minute intervals. So if you have an employee who has, a documented issue with migraines and they're late to work for 45 minutes and they're citing their migraine issue, they can use FMLA and that absence can become protected based on, it qualifying and them having FMLA eligibility. So hopefully your employees don't know this and hopefully you have no one abusing it. But if you do, there are definitely ways to combat this. But just be aware that this is out there and a big area of abuse and where you want to make sure that you're really on top of your leave management game to protect yourself against. And I've seen all things with that. So that's an overview of the different leaves and the requirements. Really want to leave you with some main takeaways because it's impossible in this presentation for me to provide all of you with guidance that is the best fit for you in terms of what your situations are, what your requirements are. If you don't have FMLA, that's part of it. What your other policies or desires are. So this is where I really want to provide some information on tips and questions and things you should keep in mind and things you should make sure as an employer you've thought about and have a plan for and defined before you start getting any more leave requests, because you definitely want to make sure you're handling every situation with each employee using the same protocol and consistency, because that is where the opportunity comes in for claims about discrimination or retaliation or all of the fun things that New York State loves to go after employers for. So some questions here. What are your leave policies, practices, and procedures now? Do you even have any? I would say probably not. Most people just have their handbook that has like the generic FMLA or PFL language in it, and it actually isn't a procedure for your organization or a roadmap for your organization to follow. So things that would be considered in your own personalized policy for your business are things like, what if someone, qualifies for multiple leaves for the same situation? So child bonding, right? That qualifies me for paid family leave and FMLA. And also maybe I have a maternity paternity benefit that I'm offering as an employer as well. How are you going to mandate that those things interact? Because if you don't have a plan for that, and I decide to just fill out the PFL paperwork and take 12 weeks of paid family leave, guess what? On day one of the 13th week, I can claim I want to take FMLA, and now I get to take 12 more weeks of FMLA, which is obviously insane. So you would certainly want in that situation to require the overlap of FMLA with any other leave that qualifies for FMLA. So that's just one example. Do you have a plan for employees to pay benefit premiums while on leave? So this is a big thing that no one considers, and the employee is obviously out. They're getting paid through New York State's disability or PFL, or it's unpaid through FMLA, but they're still staying on your health insurance and racking up a bill of unpaid portions of their part of the premium. So you want to make sure that you clearly communicate to them and set up a plan with them for how they're going to pay those premiums while they're on leave, or mention to them that they're going to have to, set up a payment plan for out of their paycheck when they get back. So again, just another hidden cost to not managing this and not having a plan for this. Allowing supplemental use of time off. So again, do you want to allow them to supplement any of their leave time with paid time off? also requiring the use of the time off. So like for a disability leave, there's the 7 days of unpaid leave. Maybe you want to require them to use accrued paid sick leave or vacation time for that period. And again, that reduces your financial risk of them taking all that time and then taking vacation time at the end. So all things that you want to consider. And then also returning someone to work. All these are job protected pretty much. So that means that while the person's out, even though you need that job to get done, you can't fill the position in a permanent way because that position needs to be available when they come back. So what are your procedures for doing that? How are you going to do it? You know, what if they come back with a need for a modified duty? Do you have a plan for that? Again, all questions that open up your business to a huge risk if you don't have a plan and deal with them properly or consistently. And that's really what that last point is there. Just having, you know, the loss of labor and workforce, if people take extensive leaves, is obviously a huge issue for your business, potentially. Again, the benefit premium costs, the double dipping on the employee benefits that are allowed and not allowed, and then the lawsuits because of inconsistent treatment. So if you don't have a plan, make a note now. We can certainly help you put one together. But it is something that most clients that I go into don't have a plan for, and sometimes they can get away with it for a long time, but it is a huge exposure area. So the takeaways of this, you know, about how can you basically have better leave management is, again, obviously we just talked about extensively developing procedures and policies. Your generic handbook requirements do not count and they don't help you. Require overlap of leave where possible. I mentioned that, but again, requiring FMLA if you qualify for any other type of leave that has similar, you know, eligibility requirements. That's the most low-hanging fruit thing that you can do, and I highly recommend it. Require use of earned time off for any unpaid portions of leave, mentioned that also, but again, like a good example is a 7-day waiting period for disability leave. I would highly recommend making that a policy. Establish internal procedures to avoid unpaid benefit premiums. We talked about that. Establish return to work protocols, and then the unpaid benefit premiums, it's on there twice. So these are really the main points that I recommend kind of walking away with and examining with your management team. A quick note on system usage. So this is kind of where our friends at Complete Payroll come in, or whoever your payroll provider is. This is a lot of different types of time off to track. And you definitely want to make sure that if someone's exhausted their eligibility for one of these leaves within a year, that you know about that so that they don't take more time off than you are required to give them. So any payroll system or time and attendance system should have the capability of establishing different codes for time for each of these different types of leave. So I would recommend setting that up if possible, and talking with your provider or going in and exploring the possibility for that yourself. Most clients I go into are using their payroll system at about 10% of its capacity, and they're paying 100% of whatever it costs them, and that's just a missed opportunity. So this is a big area where it could help with the nightmare of tracking all these leaves for your employees. Also, something to consider really quick: make your employees inactive in your payroll system when they're on leave, because that will prevent them from accruing time off and all sorts of other things that they shouldn't be getting, holiday pay, all that while they're on leave. And then there are tax implications to some of this leave stuff with the FFCRA and even with some other things. So, there's reasons to record these things that deal with that as well. All right, so basically, if you take away nothing else from this presentation, this is what I want you to know, and kind of the initial points that you can use to put together a plan to address some of this for your business. But one, have a plan, set policies and procedures for any and all leave scenarios, explore in your mind all the other areas of your business this might impact. Even something as simple as, like, how does this affect someone's, annual anniversary date? Does it push out their eligibility for a merit increase in a performance review? Like, these are all details that seem trivial now, but later when an employee is complaining about it and you don't have a good answer, you want to have answers for this. Consistency is key with everything employer related. So, I would highly recommend going through this exercise and having a plan. Ask questions, tread lightly, don't assume. I would say, this applies especially to the COVID stuff right now. If someone comes in and tells you that they've been exposed or need COVID time off, I would ask questions first to other people and then give your employee an answer, because right now it's ever changing and you don't want to do the wrong thing. Always err on the side of the employee's benefit. So if you're unsure at all, I would say pay them. Call me, but pay them in the meantime, because that's really where New York State seems to be leaning. Documentation, again, this is a general note for anything employee related, but with any of these things, always have a record of what happened, when it happened, why it happened, what you said, what you did, what the employee said and did. Require documentation where you can in terms of, like a positive COVID test result for the COVID leave. Obviously, if someone takes FMLA, you want to make sure that you make them complete the paperwork to the absolute degree and detail required, because that helps you enforce the use of it. Documentation is key in all of these situations. Be aware and beware of discrimination and retaliation exposure. This is really the biggest risk with all this stuff. If you don't do something, if you're more lenient with an employee, even on something as silly as completing paperwork to substantiate a need for leave than someone else, boom, that's a discrimination claim just waiting to happen. Oh, and by the way, if that employee also, made a complaint earlier this year about you not cleaning the break room well enough for COVID, there's a retaliation exposure claim as well, right? And also there's a ton of retaliation that occurs of employees being treated differently when they request and take leave. So make sure that you're not treating employees different for taking any of this leave time, and also make sure your managers know that, because they're the ones interacting with your employees. And so if they start, not asking Joe Schmo about working overtime, all of a sudden after he took COVID leave or FMLA or disability, he can easily claim retaliation for leave in that situation and expose your business. So if you still have questions, we always have information coming or updated resources on our website. You can subscribe to our mailing list here, although you'll all be added just by attending this webinar today. If you don't like it, you can unsubscribe. But we're constantly sending updates on this stuff. And then we always also are putting resources on our website. We really take pride in trying to anticipate what it is that employers need to know about or what it is they're pulling their hair about, and proactively providing you with information that's helpful and practical and useful. So if you haven't explored what's on our website now, I would recommend you do that. There's a COVID library on there that has some COVID leave forms in it that you can use, the paid sick leave webinar, and some other things as well. And then just in general, again, a slight little sales pitch in the end here, but our business, again, our strategy, our mission is really to partner with you and worry about these things for you so you don't need to. Just in the short time, I'm sure that you've realized how cumbersome and complicated this can be. And, certainly it's probably not practical for you to become an expert in this stuff, and nor would I wish that upon anyone. So we've dealt with these situations with leave and with any of the things that you see listed here with organizations of all sizes, all industries. And, we really are dedicated to working with you to understanding what your issues are, what your needs are, what your desires are, and putting together plans for all these things that work for you. So if you're interested in having that type of value added to your business, definitely encourage you to reach out. So on that note, I think we're at the end. I'm going to take a look at the chat and answer any questions, but everyone I believe is muted. So if you want to shout out a question, you can do that also. Just unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll take a look at some of the questions here. So are you required to have a copy of the order to quarantine or isolate from an employee for the COVID pay audit documentation, or can it just be coded by the payroll company in that manner? So New York State's been a little bit back and forth and unclear about this, but I would say if you've paid the employee, whether it's through the New York State leave or even the FFCRA leave, it's probably going to be looked upon in a positive way, but you definitely need to have some type of documentation. So if it's not an actual order to quarantine from the Department of Health, which in most cases it's probably not because those have been very impossible to get, you should have the employee complete an affirmation form where they are actually checking the reason why they had to quarantine or isolate and then signing off that they affirm that it's real. And I do have a template for that form in the COVID library on my website. So I'd recommend printing that out and then making copies of it and having it on hand. Especially if you are applying the FFCRA tax credit, you absolutely want to have at least an affirmation document that substantiates, your eligibility to provide that tax credit by paying that employee that leave, because the federal government probably will do some audits on that to make sure people weren't abusing that and, paying employees for and taking the credit for the COVID leave where they weren't really needing to have it and they were taking time off for other reasons. So that should answer that question. New York State COVID leave seems to require government orders to quarantine or isolate. Employees haven't been submitting this level of documentation for leave, which is why we have pretty much stuck with FFCRA leave. Okay, so for New York State, I think the affirmation is going to be fine as well. And also you're not getting a tax credit for that leave. So New York State doesn't care. They're not losing any money potentially in an abusive way. But the portion of the New York State leave that does require definitely really specific paperwork is that disability and paid family leave benefit, the combined benefit. And they're not going to approve that leave anyway unless the employee submits the actual order. So, in that case, I would just say the affirmation works for the New York State paid sick leave for COVID. If a child was exposed to COVID and needs to quarantine, can the parent take New York State COVID sick leave to stay home with the child? The employer is a municipality with 10 employees and does not have the New York State PFL. Okay. If the child was exposed to COVID, I don't believe, and I'll have to double check, I don't believe the New York State paid sick leave inherently covers caring for someone else that has COVID. And yeah, as a municipality, they don't qualify for the PFL, DBL, and they also, I think the FFCRA is limited to them. So that is definitely kind of a interesting, like detailed, specific question and situation. So we could talk about that April after. And if you want to contact me, we can work through that one. PFL does not need documentation, correct? If taking time off for doctor's appointment, I do not need to prove. So I'm not sure if you meant, Lisa, PFL or PSL. Yay, acronyms. But New York State paid family leave, or PFL, it does require documentation initially to be approved to even receive that benefit, similar to like disability. So there is definitely like paperwork an employee would need to complete. Okay, you mean PSL. PSL, or New York State paid sick leave, no, it does not need documentation, nor can you require documentation. If I just call in and say, oh, I have a doctor's appointment today because of a sickness that I have that you don't know about, I can't require you to prove that that you have that sickness or that I actually went to the doctor, unless it's 3 or more days in length, the time that they use the PSL. So unfortunately, no. Do we have to back pay an employee who was off due to COVID testing if they were not paid for this? Yeah, this is, I've seen this in a few situations. I would recommend doing that. Not because it's very likely that you would be audited and caught, but if the employee somehow comes across this information and realizes they were entitled to paid time off for their quarantine time, and you made them either take it unpaid or apply vacation time or something else, you know, they are going to maybe approach you and ask you about it, and then you can correct it. But also they could just decide they don't like you and they want to make your life hell and go to the DOL, and then you get the complaint through the DOL, and then you have to open up all your stuff for that reason. So I would recommend doing the right thing and being proactive and going back and taking care of that for them. Anything else? Does an employer have a right to ask for COVID negative tests if someone traveled out of state for vacation? So voluntary after their day 4 in New York quarantine. So the employer have a right to ask for, they can ask for a negative test. If they want to require that, that's up to them. However, if that requires the employee missing more time in order to get that test done and get the results, they would need to, and they should pay the employee for that additional missed time. So if they want to be that stringent and careful, that's their choice, but it comes with a cost. So that's what I would say about that. Anything else? Everyone's shy. No one wants to throw out an audio question. I've been listening to my own voice for far too long without interruption. Jen, anything on your side that you want to add or mention?
I think just kind of, going with what you were saying about keeping track of the leaves and how your payroll company or your timekeeping system will do that for you. If you aren't using Complete Payroll right now, I don't know what your system looks like, but I do know that we are tracking the PSL for the accruals for you, whether you have our timekeeping system or not. We can do that just with payroll. So, it may be confusing of different banks, but that's exactly what we do. We put banks of whether you, give somebody 40 hours of vacation time, and then you want to offer the PSL in addition to, we could set up accruals separately for that, so we can have different sorts of banks that they could take it off of. But Emily would be able to take a deeper look into whether you even need to provide that additional. I think people, Emily, and maybe you could speak to this too, is people are a little confused thinking that they see the PSL and it has to be 40 hours, assuming that they're between 5 and 99 employees, an additional 40 hours no matter what. And that's, New York State is just saying that's the minimum. So if you already have something in place that meets the minimum requirements, you don't, need in addition to. So Emily can look at your current policy and, figure out if you do need to offer additional time. And that's when, we would work together and putting the coding in the payroll or the timekeeping system in the back end. So
Yeah.
This is very overwhelming. I mean, with all the different leaves now and the federal and then the New York State and what trumps what, and it changes what feels like, every 2 weeks, something new is coming out. And we don't want you to be overwhelmed. Emily and I are here to kind of give you the bullet points and answer questions and kind of take that burden off you, so you can run your business. And, we don't want this to be so overwhelming that you feel like it's not worth it to keep running your business. Because once you start to have a lot of employees, I mean, I think the biggest concern people are having is it's hard to keep track of who left town, who's quarantining for a kid being sick, who's quarantining for their own exposure, who's quarantining for a positive test. I mean, it gets to be a lot. And, that's what we're here for, is to kind of make it simple and give you the bullet points and track it the way DOL, the Department of Labor, wants it to be tracked in both payroll and timekeeping. And then Emily's making sure that your handbook and policies are in, compliance with all of that. And then, that's just a huge weight off your shoulders. But please, feel free to reach out with any questions as they come along. And Emily and I will continue to have these webinars at least once a month on different topics. And, we'll also be doing some video blogs together that we will, make sure that we send out to you. We're just looking to kind of handhold any way we can and make sure that you guys are comfortable with, what you have, and also show you some of our services and software and how we could help, in all these ways. So try not to be overwhelmed with it, I guess, is my biggest takeaway. And
well,
just reach out to us. And
that's the point of it, is we don't want anyone to be overwhelmed, and the information can be overwhelming, but it's impossible to solve or come up with solutions for everybody in these webinars, but at least the biggest point of them is to just raise your awareness of what's out there and what you could and should be doing, and to better, protect yourself, whether it's from financial loss with this stuff or claims. And then, we're available from here to help you, to help hold your hand as you develop solutions for it. Because when we break it down, it doesn't need to be that hard, and it's not, and we're used to it. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's one employee kind of making a claim or having the Department of Labor kind of open your books of everything, and not to scare you. You just want to make sure that you have your T's crossed and your I's dotted. That's all. And we're just kind of the second and third set of eyes to make sure that that's being done.
And we will send a copy of this recording out as well for everyone.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. It was a great turnout, so appreciate it. Enjoy the sunshine today, and I'll hang out a little bit longer in case you have questions that you want to ask without everyone else here.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.